Imagine a man in his twilight years, frail and wrinkled, led to his execution chamber. You might think of a forgotten villain from a bygone era. But what if I told you this man, Walter Leroy Moody Jr., was 83 years old when the state of Alabama carried out his death sentence? What crime could possibly warrant such a fate for an octogenarian? The answer lies not in the crimes of old age, but in the terror campaign from decades past, but by the insidious anonymity of the male. The year was 1989. America wasn't gripped by overt fear, but a different kind of unease was settling in. It was a time before the omnipresent threat of terrorism we know today, yet terror arrived, packaged neatly in cardboard and stamps. It began subtly, almost like a cruel prank. Packages, seemingly innocuous, started appearing at the doorsteps of judges and lawyers in the South. But these were no ordinary deliveries. Inside, ingeniously crafted pipe bombs lay dormant, waiting to be opened, waiting to unleash chaos. The first explosion ripped through the life of Judge Robert Vance, an 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals judge in Mountain Brook, Alabama. On December 16, 1989, his wife, Helen Vance, reached for a package left at their kitchen door. The world erupted in a deafening roar. Helen was instantly killed, and Judge Vance was critically wounded, succumbing to his injuries hours later. The scene was horrific. Shrapnel and debris painted a gruesome tableau of domestic tranquility shattered by calculated malice. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the festive air of the approaching Christmas season. Days later, the terror struck again, this time claiming the life of Robert E. Robinson, a civil rights attorney in Savannah, Georgia. Another package, another unsuspecting victim. Robinson, a man dedicated to justice, became a victim of its most twisted perversion. The blast tore through his office, leaving behind a scene of devastation mirroring the Vance home. Lives irrevocably altered, families plunged into mourning, and a community paralyzed by fear. These were not random acts. The bombs were sophisticated, meticulously constructed, and delivered with chilling precision. Law enforcement scrambled to understand the motive, to find the phantom bomber who was terrorizing the South from the shadows. The FBI launched a massive investigation, codenamed Vanpack, a desperate race against time to stop the unseen enemy before he could strike again. The nation held its breath, wondering who would be next, and if anyone was safe from the deadly post. As the investigation intensified, the name Walter Leroy Moody Jr. began to surface. A man with a history of petty crimes and a simmering resentment towards the legal system. He had been convicted of possessing a pipe bomb in 1972 and had served time. This prior conviction, combined with his known grievances, placed him firmly in the crosshairs of the investigation. But proving his guilt in these sophisticated bombings was a monumental task. The investigation was a labyrinthine journey through forensic evidence, meticulous analysis of bomb fragments, and tireless detective work. The breakthrough came with the discovery of unique handwriting on labels used in the bombing campaign, handwriting that matched Moody's. Further investigation uncovered links to materials used in the bombs and circumstantial evidence that painted a damning picture. The trials that followed were protracted and complex. Moody maintained his innocence, painting himself as a victim of circumstance and prosecutorial overreach. He became his own lawyer in the federal trial, a move that many saw as a testament to his arrogance or perhaps a desperate gamble. The courtroom became a stage for his pronouncements of innocence, but the evidence mounted against him. In 1996, Moody was convicted in federal court for the mail bombings and sentenced to multiple life sentences. However, the state of Alabama pursued its own case against him for the murder of Judge Vance, seeking the ultimate penalty, death. In 2000, he was found guilty in Alabama and sentenced to death. Years turned into decades. Moody, incarcerated, became a figure of grim fascination. Appeals were filed, legal battles waged, but the wheels of justice, slow and inexorable, continued to turn. He aged within the prison walls, his hair turned white, his body weakened, but his spirit, defiant to the end, seemingly unbroken. The ethical questions surrounding the execution of an elderly man loomed large. Was it just to execute an 83-year-old, decades after the crimes were committed? Had he become a different person in those intervening years? Did his advanced age diminish the need for retribution or the deterrent effect of the death penalty? These questions swirled around the case, debated in legal circles and public forums, but ultimately, they did not sway the course of justice. April 19, 2018. The day arrived. Walter Leroy Moody Jr., now frail and aged, was led to the execution chamber at Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama. His last days were spent in quiet defiance, maintaining his innocence to the very end. There were no dramatic confessions, no tearful apologies. He remained an enigma, a man who took his secrets to the grave. His last words, delivered with a steady voice, were a final unwavering denial: "I did not commit these crimes." He expressed love for his family and declared, "This is a persecution, not a prosecution." Then, the lethal injection was administered. At 8:42 p.m. Central Time, Walter Leroy Moody Jr. was pronounced dead. He became the oldest person executed in the United States in the modern era of the death penalty. Was justice truly served? Did the execution of an elderly man bring closure to the families of Judge Vance and Robert Robinson? Or did it simply add another layer of tragedy to a story already steeped in pain and loss? Was the execution a necessary act of retribution, or a reflection of a system that struggles to find meaning and closure in the face of profound violence? What do you think? The case of Walter Leroy Moody Jr. serves as a chilling reminder that terror can arrive in the most unexpected forms. It highlights the enduring scars left by violence, the complexities of justice, and the haunting question of whether true closure is ever truly attainable. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the shadows of past crimes can stretch long and dark, sometimes reaching even into the twilight years of those who commit them. The postman delivers, but sometimes he carries death. Next on the roll is Carl Wayne Bunchen. On April 21, 2022, Carl Wayne Bunchen, a 78-year-old man confined to a wheelchair and grappling with chronic illness, was wheeled into Texas Huntsville Unit Execution Chamber. His final words, an apology to the family of Houston police officer James Irby, whom he had murdered 32 years earlier, marked the end of a decades-long legal saga. Bunchen's execution made him the oldest person put to death in Texas since the state reinstated capital punishment in 1982. His case, however, transcended the grim details of his crime. It became a lightning rod for debates about aging on death row, the morality of executing elderly inmates, and the haunting question of whether justice delayed can ever truly be justice served. On June 27, 1990, Houston police officer James Irby, a 37-year-old husband and father of two, pulled over a red Chevrolet Monte Carlo for a routine traffic violation. The car lacked a front license plate, a minor infraction that Irby, a 14-year veteran known for his calm demeanor, intended to address swiftly. Inside the vehicle were two men: the driver, Carol Bunchen, no relation to Carl, and his passenger, Carl Wayne Bunchen, a 46-year-old parolee with a criminal record spanning 3 decades. What happened next unfolded with brutal swiftness. As Irby radioed dispatch, Carl Bunchen exited the passenger side, drew a .357 Magnum revolver, and fired a single shot into the officer's head at point-blank range. As Irby collapsed, Bunchen fired 2 more rounds into his back. The attack, witnessed by horrified onlookers, was not a spontaneous act but a calculated execution. Bunchen fled the scene, igniting a city-wide manhunt. He was apprehended hours later, hiding in a warehouse, where police found methamphetamine and a knife in his possession. The murder weapon, traced to a pawnshop Bunchen had visited days earlier, cemented his guilt. James Irby's death sent shockwaves through Houston. Colleagues remembered him as a dedicated officer who balanced toughness with compassion. His widow, Maura Irby, later recounted the moment her life shattered. "The police chaplain came to my door. I knew before he said a word." Carl Wayne Bunchen's path to that fatal traffic stop was paved with violence and defiance. Born in 1944, he began his criminal career as a teenager, racking up arrests for theft and assault. In 1967, he was sentenced to 10 years for robbery. Paroled in 1971, he shot a man during a drug deal but plea bargained the charge down to misdemeanor assault. By 1980, he was serving another decade-long sentence for rape. Paroled in 1989, he quickly relapsed into methamphetamine use and petty crime. Psychiatric evaluations and court records painted Bunchen as a volatile, remorseless figure. A 1991 assessment described him as having antisocial personality disorder and a profound lack of empathy. Prosecutors argued that his murder of Irby was not an isolated act but the culmination of a lifetime of resentment toward authority. He didn't just hate police, one prosecutor later said. He hated anyone who tried to control him. Bunchen's 1991 trial was a stark affair. Eyewitnesses, ballistic evidence, and his own confession left little room for doubt. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney Alan Tanner, attempted to argue that Bunchen had acted in a meth-induced psychosis. This claim crumbled under cross-examination. Witnesses testified that Bunchen had been coherent and deliberate during the shooting. The trial's most poignant moment came when Maura Irby addressed the court. "He didn't just kill my husband," she said, her voice steady but strained. "He killed my children's father. He took away their protector, their guide. They'll never have him to walk them down the aisle or hold their children." Jurors deliberated for just 3 hours before sentencing Bunchen to death. Bunchen's arrival on Texas death row in 1991 marked the beginning of a legal odyssey that outlived many of the lawyers, judges, and policymakers involved in his case. Over 31 years, his attorneys filed countless appeals, arguing ineffective counsel, prosecutorial misconduct, and flawed jury instructions. In 2009, a federal court overturned his death sentence, ruling that jurors had not been properly instructed to consider his troubled upbringing and meth addiction as mitigating factors. The victory was short-lived. In 2012, the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals reinstated the sentence, declaring the original trial's errors harmless. Life on death row transformed Bunchen physically and emotionally. Confined to a 6-by-10-foot cell at the Polunsky unit, he spent 23 hours a day in isolation. Prison records reveal a man oscillating between contrition and defiance. He claimed to have found religion, writing letters to the Irby family expressing remorse. "I pray for your healing every night," he wrote in 2015. Yet disciplinary reports document frequent outbursts, including threats against guards and attempts to hoard medication. By 2020, age and incarceration had taken their toll. Bunchen, now reliant on a wheelchair, suffered from arthritis, coronary disease, and vertigo. His lawyers petitioned for clemency, arguing that executing a frail, elderly man violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. "This isn't the same person who killed Officer Irby," Attorney James Ridding pleaded. State attorneys countered that Bunchen's age and health were irrelevant. "He had 32 years to make peace," prosecutor Joshua Rice said. "His victims didn't get that time." In his final hours, Bunchen declined a last meal, opting instead for a cup of coffee. In a brief interview with the Houston Chronicle, he struck a tone of resignation. "I'm ready to face God. I hope he's more merciful than the people here." At 6:39 p.m. on April 21, 2022, the lethal injection process began. Maura Irby and her 2 daughters, now adults, watched through a glass partition as Bunchen, his hands trembling, delivered his final statement. "I want to apologize to the family. I pray to God that you get the closure for me killing your dad." The apology, his first in 32 years, was met with silence. 10 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Bunchen's execution reignited long-simmering debates about the death penalty's application to aging inmates. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, over 11% of U.S. death row inmates are over 60, many of whom, like Bunchen, have spent decades in harsh, isolated conditions. Critics argue that executing elderly prisoners, often physically and mentally diminished, serves no retributive or deterrent purpose. "It's not justice, it's ritualistic cruelty," said Attorney James Ridding. Proponents, however, maintain that time should not dilute accountability. "James Irby never got to grow old," said Andy Kahan, a victims' rights advocate. "Why should his killer?" For Maura Irby, the execution brought neither solace nor closure. "There's no winning here," she told reporters. But today, the law did what it promised. Bunchen's case underscores systemic tensions within American capital punishment. As death row populations age, states face logistical and ethical quandaries. Executing frail inmates requires costly medical oversight, while long-term solitary confinement, a hallmark of death row, exacerbates physical and mental decline. In 2023, Texas lawmakers proposed bills to bar executions of inmates over 70, but the measures stalled amid political opposition. Carl Bunchan's story, however, transcends policy. It is a grim reminder of crime's enduring ripple effects and the human cost of delayed justice. 32 years after a single bullet erased James Irby's future, two families remained bound by grief, one mourning a hero, the other burying a murderer. In the end, Bunchan's execution resolved little but exposed much about vengeance, forgiveness, and the limits of a justice system that too often conflates the two. Continuing our exploration into the lives of America's most notorious criminals, we delve into the story of Viva Leroy Nash, a man whose criminal career spanned nearly 8 decades, making him one of the oldest inmates on death row. Born on September 10, 1915, in Salt Lake City, Utah, Nash's early years were marred by criminal activity. At just 15, he embarked on a life of crime, leading to his first imprisonment in 1930 for armed robbery. In 1947, at the age of 32, Nash's criminal actions escalated when he shot a Connecticut police officer. This act resulted in a nearly 25-year imprisonment, during which he attempted several escapes, earning him the moniker Jail Houdini. After his release, Nash's criminal activities continued unabated. In 1977, during a robbery in Salt Lake City, he murdered postal carrier David J. Woodhurst, who had inadvertently entered the jewelry store Nash was robbing. This crime led to a life sentence. Demonstrating a persistent defiance of authority, Nash escaped from a prison work crew in 1982. Just 3 weeks later, on November 3, 1982, he entered the Moon Valley Coin and Stamp Shop in Phoenix, Arizona. There, he fatally shot 23-year-old employee Greg West. Store owner Susan McCullough recounted the harrowing experience, noting how Nash pointed the gun at her, pulled the trigger, but the firearm malfunctioned, allowing her to escape. Nash was swiftly apprehended following the Phoenix murder. In 1983, he was convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Greg West. His time on death row was marked by numerous appeals, with his attorneys arguing that his advanced age and deteriorating mental health rendered him incompetent for execution. They described him as a doddering old man who can't hear, can't see, can't walk, and is very, very loony. Nash's health continued to deteriorate during his incarceration. He suffered multiple heart attacks and was diagnosed with dementia, becoming almost entirely deaf and blind. These conditions led to his transfer to a state medical facility, where he remained until his death. On February 12, 2010, Viva Leroy Nash died of natural causes at the age of 94 in the Arizona Amon State Prison Complex. At the time of his death, he was the oldest person on death row in the United States. Nash's case reignited debates about the ethics and costs associated with maintaining elderly inmates on death row. His prolonged incarceration, coupled with severe health issues, highlighted the complexities of the justice system in dealing with aging prisoners. The financial implications of providing medical care for such inmates further fueled discussions on the efficacy and morality of capital punishment, especially for those unlikely to face execution due to health constraints. Viva Leroy Nash's life serves as a stark reminder of the challenges inherent in the criminal justice system, particularly concerning lifelong offenders and the ethical dilemmas posed by aging death row inmates. Next on the roll, Billy Wayne Coble. In the quiet hours before dawn on February 28, 2019, 70-year-old Billy Wayne Coble sat on a gurney in Texas' Huntsville unit, his wrists bound, his voice steady. When asked for his final words, he replied with eerie calm, "That'll be $5. The remark, a cryptic reference to a decades-old inside joke, was his last act of defiance. Moments later, he was executed for the 1989 murders of his estranged wife's brother, Robert Vicha, and her parents, Zelda and Robert Goodman. Nearly 3 years later, on April 21, 2022, another elderly man, 78-year-old Carl Wayne Bunchan, was wheeled into the same chamber. Frail, nearly blind, and apologetic, he addressed the family of Houston police officer James Irby, whom he had murdered in 1990, "I pray to God that you get the closure for me killing your dad." These two men, separated by time, motive, and circumstance, shared a grim distinction. They became the oldest inmates executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. Their cases, spanning decades of legal battles and moral reckonings, reveal the complexities of justice delayed, the ethics of executing the elderly, and the enduring scars of violence. Carl Wayne Bunchan's life was a mosaic of addiction, rage, and institutional failure. Born in 1944, he began his criminal career as a teenager, cycling through arrests for theft, assault, and drug offenses. By 1967, he was serving a 10-year sentence for robbery. Paroled in 1971, he shot a man during a methamphetamine deal but plea bargained the charge to a misdemeanor. In 1980, he received another decade-long sentence for rape. Paroled in 1989, he relapsed into meth use, drifting through Houston's underbelly until June 27, 1990, when his path collided with that of Officer James Irby. Irby, a 37-year-old father of two, had built a reputation as a compassionate yet no-nonsense officer. On that sweltering summer day, he pulled over a red Chevrolet Monte Carlo for a missing front license plate. Inside were driver Carol Bunchan, no relation, and Carl, who was wanted for a parole violation. As Irby radioed dispatch, Carl exited the car, drew a .357 Magnum, and fired a bullet into the officer's head at point-blank range. Two more shots followed as Irby lay bleeding. Bunchan fled but was captured hours later in a warehouse, methamphetamine and a knife in his pockets. At trial, prosecutors painted Bunchan as a remorseless predator. Eyewitnesses, ballistic evidence, and his confession sealed his fate. The defense's claim of meth-induced psychosis crumbled under scrutiny. Maura Irby, James' widow, delivered a gut-wrenching victim impact statement. "He didn't just kill my husband. He killed my children's father, their protector." Jurors took 3 hours to sentence him to death. For 31 years, Bunchan languished on death row, his appeals a labyrinth of legal technicalities. In 2009, a federal court overturned his sentence due to flawed jury instructions, but the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court reinstated it in 2012. By 2020, arthritis, heart disease, and vertigo had ravaged his body. His lawyers argued that executing a geriatric inmate was unconstitutional, but prosecutors countered, he had 32 years to make peace. His victims didn't get that time. On April 21, 2022, Bunchan declined a last meal, opting for coffee. In a final interview, he said, "I'm ready to face God." As the lethal injection flowed, Maura Irby and her daughters watched silently. His apology, 32 years overdue, changed little. "Closure doesn't exist," Maura later said. But today, justice finally did. Billy Wayne Coble's story began with a crumbling marriage and ended in a bloodbath. In August 1989, his wife, Karen Vicha, filed for divorce after 17 years. Coble, a Vietnam veteran and former mechanic, spiraled into paranoia. Convinced Karen's family had turned her against him, he plotted revenge. On August 29th, he bound Karen and her 2 daughters with duct tape in their Axtell, Texas, home. When Karen's brother, Bobby Vicha, arrived to check on her, Coble shot him dead. He then drove to the home of Karen's parents, 64-year-old Zelda and 66-year-old Robert Goodman. After forcing his way inside, he executed them both. Karen's nephew, Waco police officer Carl Levin, arrived next. Coble shot him 3 times, leaving him permanently disabled. Coble fled but was captured after a shootout with police. At trial, prosecutors presented a chilling diary entry, "I will kill them all. I have nothing left to live for." The jury deliberated for 15 minutes before sentencing him to death. Over 29 years on death row, Coble became a paradox. He claimed to find religion, yet prison records detailed threats against guards and boasts about his crimes. In 2007, his sentence was overturned due to flawed jury instructions, but a retrial reaffirmed his death sentence in 2008. By 2019, diabetes and heart disease had weakened him, but his defiance never wavered. In his final statement, Coble smirked, "That'll be $5. The phrase, a nod to a joke he'd shared with his victims, was a final act of cruelty. Karen Vicha, watching through the chamber window, shook her head. "He died the same way he lived, without remorse," she said later. Bunchen and Coble's cases reignited debates about aging on death row. By 2022, over 11% of U.S. death row inmates were over 60, many physically and mentally debilitated by decades of isolation. Critics argue that executing elderly inmates serves no retributive purpose. "It's not justice, it's ritualistic cruelty," said Bunchen's attorney, James Ritting. Proponents counter that time should not absolve accountability. "James Irby never got to grow old," said victims' rights advocate Andy Kahan. "Why should his killer?" For families, the executions brought ambiguous closure. Karen Vitcher reflected, "It doesn't heal anything. It just ends something." Texas, the nation's execution capital, grapples with these questions daily. While lawmakers have proposed age caps for executions, political will remains lacking. Meanwhile, death row continues to gray, with inmates like Bunchen and Coble embodying a system's unresolved tensions. Carl Bunchen and Billy Coble died as they lived, one shrouded in belated regret, the other in defiance. Their crimes, trials, and decades-long waits for execution underscore the paradox of American capital punishment, a system that promises finality yet often delivers only prolonged anguish. Bunchen's apology and Coble's sneer bookend a spectrum of human response to mortality. Yet both cases ask the same unresolved question: when justice takes decades, who does it truly serve? For the families of James Irby and the Vitcher Goodmans, the answer remains as fractured as the lives left behind. Finally on our list is Oscar Ray Boland Jr. On January 7, 2016, Oscar Ray Boland Jr., a 68-year-old man with a shock of white hair and a history of courtroom theatrics, was strapped to a gurney in Florida's execution chamber. Asked for his final words, he declared, "I am innocent. They are killing me tonight for something I did not do." His final apology, "I pray to God that you get the closure for me killing your dad," contrasted starkly with Boland's defiance. Though separated by geography, motive, and demeanor, both men shared a grim legacy. They were among the oldest individuals executed in modern U.S. history, their cases embodying the fraught intersection of aging, justice, and the death penalty's unresolved ethical dilemmas. Carl Wayne Bunchen's life was a chronicle of institutional failure and self-destruction. Born in 1944, he racked up arrests for theft, assault, and drug offenses by his late teens. In 1967, he began a 10-year prison stint for robbery. Paroled in 1971, he shot a man during a methamphetamine deal but plea bargained the charge to a misdemeanor. By 1980, he was serving another decade for rape. Released in 1989, he quickly relapsed into addiction, drifting through Houston's underbelly until June 27, 1990, when a routine traffic stop sealed his fate. Officer James Irby, a 37-year-old father of two, had built a reputation as a fair-minded peacekeeper. That afternoon, he pulled over a red Chevrolet Monte Carlo for a missing front license plate. Inside were driver Carol Bunchen, no relation, and Carl, a parolee wanted for a minor violation. As Irby radioed dispatch, Carl exited the vehicle, drew a .357 Magnum, and fired a single shot into the officer's head at point-blank range. 2 more rounds struck Irby's back as he lay dying. Bunchen fled but was captured hours later in a warehouse, methamphetamine and a knife in his pockets. At trial, prosecutors dismantled Bunchen's claim of meth-induced psychosis. Eyewitnesses, ballistic evidence, and his confession left no doubt. The defense's plea for leniency crumbled when Maura Irby, James' widow, delivered a searing victim impact statement. "He didn't just kill my husband. He killed my children's father, their protector." Jurors deliberated for 3 hours before sentencing him to death. Over the next 31 years, Bunchen's appeals became a legal odyssey. In 2009, a federal court overturned his sentence, citing flawed jury instructions, but the Fifth U.S. Circuit Court reinstated it in 2012. By 2020, arthritis, heart disease, and vertigo had left him wheelchair-bound. His lawyers argued that executing a geriatric inmate violated the Eighth Amendment, but prosecutors retorted, he had 32 years to make peace. His victims didn't get that time. On April 21, 2022, Bunchen declined a last meal, opting for coffee. In a final interview with the Houston Chronicle, he said, "I'm ready to face God." As the lethal injection flowed, Maura Irby and her daughters watched silently. His apology, 3 decades overdue, rang hollow. Closure doesn't exist, Maura later reflected. But today, justice finally did. Oscar Ray Boland Jr.'s crimes were as calculated as his courtroom persona was theatrical. Born in 1959, Boland drifted through odd jobs in Florida before his arrest in 1986 for the brutal murders of 3 women: 25-year-old Terry Lynn Matthews, 17-year-old Stephanie Collins, and 26-year-old Natalie Blanche Hawley. Each killing bore his signature: abduction, sexual assault, and fatal blunt force trauma. The crimes. Terry Lynn Matthews, December 5, 1986, a nursing student. Matthews was abducted from a Pasco County convenience store. Her body was found in a citrus grove, her skull crushed. Stephanie Collins, November 18, 1986. Collins vanished while walking to a school bus stop. Her remains were discovered in a shallow grave, a concrete slab embedded in her skull. Natalie Blanche Hawley, January 25, 1986. Hawley, a mother of 2, was found naked and beaten in a rural ditch. Boland's arrest in 1990 came after his ex-wife, Kathleen Reeves, told police he had confessed to the murders. Physical evidence, including a palm print on Hawley's car and soil matching the crime scenes on his boots, sealed his fate. Yet Boland's trials became a circus. He fired attorneys, represented himself, and even married a public defender, Rosalie Martinez, during proceedings. Boland's 3 convictions, 1 for each murder, were overturned twice due to procedural errors, forcing survivors' families to endure 7 trials over 25 years. In 1992, he was sentenced to death for Matthews' murder, but the Florida Supreme Court reversed it in 1994. Retried in 1995, he received another death sentence, which was overturned in 1996. A 3rd trial in 2001 reaffirmed his death penalty. Similar roller coaster rulings followed for the Collins and Hawley murders. Victims' families accused Boland of weaponizing the legal system. "He enjoyed torturing us," said Kathleen Reeves, Hawley's sister. Every appeal was another twist of the knife. By 2016, Boland had spent 25 years on death row. His health declined, diabetes and heart disease left him frail, but his narcissism never wavered. In a 2015 interview, he boasted, "I'll be remembered long after they're gone." On January 7, 2016, Boland was executed for Matthews' murder. Family members of all 3 victims attended, including Matthews' mother, Kathleen Reeves, who had campaigned for his execution for decades. Asked for final words, Boland smirked, "I am innocent. They are killing me tonight for something I did not do." Reeves later countered, "His last lie died with him." The lethal injection took 13 minutes. Boland's death closed a 30-year saga but offered little solace. "There's no victory here," said Hawley's daughter, Teresa. "Just an end." Both men spent decades in isolation, their health deteriorating while appeals dragged on. By 2022, 11% of U.S. death row inmates were over 60, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. Critics argue that executing elderly inmates, often physically and mentally diminished, serves no retributive purpose. "It's not justice, it's ritualistic cruelty," said Bunch's attorney, James Ritting. Boland's 7 trials exemplify how procedural errors prolong trauma. "The system re-victimizes families," said Matthews' mother, Kathleen Reeves. Bunch's apology and Boland's defiance frame a central question: does time dilute guilt? Prosecutors say no. "James Irby never got to grow old," said victims' rights advocate Andy Kahan. "Why should his killer?" Bunchen and Boland died as they lived, one shrouded in belated regret, the other in narcissistic denial. Their cases reveal capital punishment's paradox. It promises closure yet often delivers only prolonged anguish. For families like the Irbys and Reeves, executions brought neither healing nor peace. "It doesn't fix anything," said Teresa Hawley. "It just ends something." As America's death row population grows, these cases demand reckoning. Is executing elderly inmates justice, or merely vengeance masquerading as law? The answer, like the stories of Bunchen and Boland, remains fraught, unresolved, and deeply human. This is True Criminal Records, specifically happened in the United States. I will be bringing all true criminal stories to you here on my channel. If you would like to get more information like this, comment and subscribe to my channel now.